Hello there, Michelle Short here for My Favourite Things. Today I have a circle card to share with you using cotton candy critters. So let's get started. This is the adorable cotton candy critters stamp set. I have stamped the cart and the cat onto some smooth white cardstock using black ink, and I'm going to colour the images with Copic markers. I ended up using a lot of pink on this image. Here in the UK, cotton candy is called candy floss. So if I do say candy floss, I just want to let you know what I mean. I mean cotton candy. And so because candy floss is pink generally in colour, I wanted to go for very kind of a sort of pastel-y vibe for the whole card itself. So I'm using, I guess what I would say is more lighter shades. I didn't try to add too much contrast between the colours, and I will get onto that a little bit later why I wish that maybe I had, but I was, like I said, going for more lighter shades here. So I started off with the darker pinks, which is the RV19. I blended that out with the RV66, followed by the RV55, and then for my lightest shade I'm using RV52, but there is quite a jump between the RV55 and the RV52, so I do go back in with the two shades and try and get like a nice smooth transition. And then for the wheel and all of these outside pieces, I go in with the RV52 and then I add in a little bit of the RV55 just on the areas where they kind of meet each other. And I apologise for getting my head in the way there. When I'm colouring ordinarily, not on screen, I do tend to really lean over my images while I'm colouring. I don't know if anyone else does that. So I do sometimes find it quite difficult with these images that are quite small in certain areas for me not to try and get my head in the way, so I do apologise for that. For the awning, I'm using the exact same shades of the pink. Like I said, I wanted to keep it quite cohesive, so I'm going in first with the RV55 and then I'm going in with RV52. And I go over all of these sections here, but actually I do tend to get a smoother blend if I do one section at a time. So I go back in with the RV55 and then blend that out with the RV52. And as you can see, I do get a much better blend that way. I did want to bring in a little bit of an extra colour, so I'm using some muted purples. This is BV11. And then I blend that out with the BV00, followed by the BV quadruple 0. Then for the candy floss itself, again, I'm using those same pink shades. So I went in with RV55, blending that out with the RV52. And this time I'm going to go in with a lighter shade, which is RV00. Then for the candy floss machine itself, I'm using some B00 for the top part, blending that out with the B quadruple 0. And then for the bottom part, I'm going to use some light greys, so C3, C1 and C00. And then for the cone part on the candy floss, I'm using some Y00. Then for the balloons, I'm using the exact same shades that I did for the awning. So I'm using BV11, BV00 and BV quadruple 0 for the purple balloons. And then RV55, RV52 and RV00 for the pink balloons. And it was at this point I really wished that I'd gone a little bit deeper with my shades. I wasn't particularly happy with how I coloured in these balloons, but to be honest with you, I didn't really know how to rectify it because I wanted to keep this whole card quite sort of light and pastel-y, that like I didn't really want to add any darker shades into it. In hindsight, maybe I should have done. I think I would have been happier with the colouring. I could have gone in with some colour pencils maybe. Sometimes when I'm not quite happy with the Copic colouring, I tend to go over them with some colour pencils, and I do tend to get a slightly deeper shade. In the end, the sentiment does cover most of the balloons anyway, so I decided to leave it as is, but I can't say I'm particularly happy with them, but that's okay. For the cat, I think it's supposed to be a tabby cat, but I decided to colour it in greys because I didn't want to add any extra colour onto the card. So I started off with my darkest shade, which was C7, blending that out with the C5. I'm then going in with C3. And then finish off the darker areas with the C1. And then I do add that C1 into the lighter areas. And then I blend that out with the C00. And then I add a little bit of that RV52 into the centres of the ears. And then I'm just doing the candy floss the exact same colours. I'm then taking the coordinating cotton candy critters dynamics, holding those down with some low tack tape and running those through my die cutting machine. And I really love that the dies do cut out all of those little pieces in the centre of this cart. So now I've got my cart and my little cat here. I've then cut some circles from white cardstock using the A2 stitch circle stacks dies. So I've cut 2 of a larger size and 1 of a slightly smaller size, and the slightly smaller one I'm going to do some ink blending on top. The larger ones are going to be my card base. So I'm adding in some grass here using distress ink. So I'm starting off with Twisted Citron, and I'm just doing that at the very bottom of this circle here. At the moment it's on the right hand side, but it will end up being at the bottom. I'm then going in with Mowed Lawn and just darkening that up just a little bit at the bottom. And then I can bring in Mermaid Lagoon for the sky. So I'm just going to cover in the rest of the panel here. And I'm focusing the darker colour towards the top. I did think about going in with like a cloud background, but most of this is going to get covered up, so I really just wanted to have kind of like a hint of a background. So just using that blending brush here and just blending that out, and I am trying to leave a little bit of a white gap between the grass and the sky. So just adding in as much as I think to get the saturation that I want. I can then stamp a sentiment from the Cotton Candy Critters stamp set. I'm stamping that onto some black licorice cardstock. So I've prepped that cardstock with an anti-static powder tool, and I do like to remove the excess powder with a brush. And then I'm inking up the stamp using Versamark ink and stamping that down. I'm adding some detail white embossing powder. I do like to add it a few times, tap off the excess, and then I can bring in a dry brush to remove any excess powder where I don't want it. I can then heat set the sentiment until it's completely melted. And then once it's cool, I can remove any excess anti-static powder with a cloth. I'm then going to die cut the sentiment using the Itty Bitty Strips dies. So I can just hold that in place and run that through my die cutting machine. I've then got one of those larger circles that I cut, and I'm just using a bone folder and a scoreboard here to add kind of like a score line towards the bottom. I'm actually just going to cut this piece off, so I didn't really need to add a score line, but sometimes I find it a little bit easier to add that score line to start with. And then I can bring that over to my guillotine and just cut that off, and that's just going to create a little notch at the bottom of the card so that it stands up nicely. I can then bring this piece back to the scoreboard, and I can use that to pop in that circle so that it's all the way to the side, and then I can add another scoring line, and this will create a hinge for me to be able to make this circle into a card base. I can then add some adhesive onto that top part of the hinge, And then I can bring in the other circle here and adhere that on top, and that's going to create my card base. So just lining those up as best as possible, and then once I'm happy I can really press that down. And I'm just going to use a bone folder as well on the back just to make sure that that's really well stuck down. I've then added some thin foam tape onto the back of the card, and then I can pop that down onto the ink blended panel. And then for the cat, I've just added some foam tape onto the right hand side, and then I can add a little bit of tape runner adhesive onto the left because I'm going to overlap him with the card, and I wanted it to all be the same level. So just popping him down there, and then I've added some foam tape onto the back of the sentiment just on the left hand side, and I can pop that down as well. I then want to make sure that I adhere this panel onto my card base straight, so I'm using that notch there at the bottom to line that up with the grid lines on my mat, holding that down with a little bit of post-it tape so it doesn't move as I add the panel on top. And then I've added some thin foam tape onto the back of that, and then I can pop that down, and I'm just using the grid lines on my mat to try and line up that sentiment. I can remove that post-it tape, and then I'm just going to hold up the card to make sure that that is straight. So I can just reinforce that hinge there so that it's going to stand up really nicely, and thankfully it is straight. And then to finish off, I'm just adding some white gel pen highlights to those balloons. Like I said, I wasn't particularly happy with them, so I think it just added a little bit of interest onto those balloons. I did think about maybe adding some glossy accents on top, and that would cover up a little bit of the colouring, but I would have had to have removed that sentiment and then add it back on. So I decided not to, but I just went with the white gel pen instead. And so that is the card finished for today. I really love that it's a circle card. I do think some sets and some images just work better on a circle card, and I thought that these did. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description box here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.